There is a hippo in the desert. 85,000 years ago, on what is now the dry golden sand of northern Saudi Arabia, a hippo is wading in a permanent lake. Around it, ostriches walk through the grass. Wild cattle graze. Elephants drink from the shallows. The sky is open and the air is warm, and the land, in every direction, looks more like the savanna of East Africa than anything you would recognize today. And among those animals, walking the same shoreline, hunting them and drinking from the same water, are small bands of people. They are Homo sapiens. They are us. They have, very recently in the long arc of our species, just walked out of Africa. One of them, somewhere along that ancient lakeshore, loses a finger bone. Maybe an injury, maybe a death. Maybe nothing more than a body that the wind and the sediment gently buried over the next 90 millennia. We do not know. What we know is this. In 2016, a researcher from the Saudi Geological Survey was walking the dried-out bed of that same lake, now called Al-Wusta, in the heart of the Nifud Desert, and bent down and picked up a small, perfectly preserved bone, about 3 centimeters long, slim, slightly curved, unmistakably human. When it was dated, it came back at roughly 85,000 years old. For a long time, the textbook story of how humans left Africa went something like this. Around 60,000 years ago, a small group walked north, through the Levant, and from there spread across the rest of the world. Everyone alive today outside of Africa descends from that single late wave. That was the story. The finger bone in the Saudi desert quietly destroyed it. Because that finger is older than 60,000 years. By a lot. It is older than the Levant fossils. It is the oldest directly dated piece of a modern human ever found outside Africa and its immediate neighbor, the Eastern Mediterranean. And the person it belonged to was not on a coast. They were not hugging the shoreline of the Red Sea, the way one popular theory had imagined. They were deep inland, in the middle of what is now one of the driest places on Earth, hundreds of kilometers from any modern water. And the finger was not the only thing. Not far away, in the dunes near Tabuk in the northwest of the country, archaeologists found something even more intimate. Footprints. Pressed into the soft mud of what had once been the shoreline of another vanished lake. Human footprints, walking in different directions, the way people do when they are not in a hurry. Around them, the prints of elephants, the prints of giant wild cattle. Hundreds of tracks on the floor of a world that no longer exists. Some of those footprints, when measured, belonged to children. Children's footprints, walking beside elephants, on the bed of what is now one of the most arid places on the planet. That is the picture you have to hold in your head as I tell you the rest of this. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Whoever lost that finger, whoever made those small footprints in the mud, they were not on the way to somewhere else. They were home. They were settled. They were hunting big game, on the shore of a lake big enough for hippos, in a paradise that does not exist anymore. The Arabian Peninsula was not the door humans walked through to get to the rest of the world. It was the first room, the first stop, the first new home our species ever made outside the continent of our birth. Imagine, for a second, what it would have looked like to walk in. You would have come up out of the Horn of Africa, across the narrow gap of the Red Sea, into a country that smelled like rain, long grass to the horizon, reed beds the color of beaten gold, lakes so wide you could not see the other side, the bellow of hippos at night, the trumpeting of elephants at dawn, stars unlike any you have seen, because nobody has ever stood in this place before to see them, and no other humans for as far as you could walk in any direction. The whole of Arabia, just sitting there, waiting. And here is where it gets stranger. It was not a one-time thing. Researchers digging into the Nifud have now mapped at least 5 separate periods over the last 400,000 years when the desert became green. 5 times the rains came. 5 times permanent lakes formed in the hollows between the dunes. 5 times the grass grew, and the hippos and the elephants and the antelope wandered north out of Africa to drink. And 5 times, with them, came humans. Each pulse, a different group. Each pulse, different stone tools. Each pulse, a different chapter of the human story unfolding in the same valley. Then the rains would stop. The lakes would shrink. The grass would die. The hippos would either move on or die where they stood, leaving their bones in the mud. And the people, some of them, would move on with the green, following the water, pushing east, pushing north. Some of them, though, stayed. This is the part that, when I understood it, completely changed how I thought about the modern Arabian world. For a long time, when we talked about Saudi DNA or Arab DNA, there was an unspoken assumption that we were talking about something fairly recent. The rise of Islam, the spread of Arabic, the great trading empires of the medieval world. Big movements of people across the Middle East over the last 2,000 years. All of that is in there. All of it is real. But under all of that, in the bones and the blood of the indigenous tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, there is something much, much older. Modern genetic studies, looking at thousands of indigenous Saudi individuals across more than 20 large tribes, have found something quite extraordinary. The deep tribal structure of Arabia, the practice of marrying within the tribe that has gone on for thousands of years, has acted like a preservation chamber. It has held things still. While the rest of the world's populations were churning, mixing, replacing each other in wave after wave, the tribal lineages of Arabia kept many of their ancient genetic signatures intact. When you compare them to the genomes of the world's other populations, indigenous Arabs cluster as their own unique group. Not Levantine, not African, not Persian, their own thing. And when geneticists trace that thing backwards, what they find is striking. Indigenous Arabs appear to be among the closest living descendants of the very first split from ancient Eurasian populations, the people who left Africa and became the ancestors of everyone outside it. Read that again, slowly. The people who took the very first successful step out of Africa into the wider world were not just passing through Arabia. Some of them stopped there. They stayed. And their descendants are still there. Still walking the same land their many times great-grandparents walked when there were hippos in the lakes. 85,000 years of continuity, maybe more. Of course, the modern Arabian world is also a layered one, and any honest story has to say so. The Hajj has been bringing pilgrims, sometimes hundreds of thousands a year, in our time millions, to the cities of Mecca and Medina for nearly 1,400 years. Some of them stayed, generations of them. The trade routes pulled in travelers from East Africa, from Persia, from India, from the Levant, from the Caucasus. All of it left a trace. In many modern Saudi genomes, you can see a small sub-Saharan African echo dating back roughly to the medieval Indian Ocean trade. You can see a thin Persian line in the east. You can see Levantine signals in the north. But under all of that, under the trade, under the empires, under the long centuries of pilgrims arriving and never leaving, the deepest layer in the indigenous Arabian gene pool is older than any of it. It is the Green Arabia layer, the lake and hippo layer, the people who walked through the open door and decided, while the door was still open, that this was the place. The desert turned dry, the lakes vanished, the animals died, the greenery retreated south, and those people who could so easily have just left, who could so easily have followed the water and become someone else, they adapted. They learned to read the wadis. They learned to read the stars. They learned to keep camels and find shade and read the wind. They became Bedouin. They became the people of a place that had once been a garden and was now a furnace, and they held on. Think for a moment about what that kind of holding on actually requires. It requires knowledge being passed, mouth to ear, parent to child, across generations, whose individual names are all lost now, about which plant blooms after the first storm, about which star sits over which waterhole at which time of year, about how to read the wind for the smell of rain a day before it arrives. 85,000 years of that. 85,000 years of a single, slowly evolving body of knowledge about a single piece of land. Arabic, the language that eventually crystallized from that long inheritance, has dozens of distinct words for kinds of desert, kinds of dune, kinds of wind, kinds of sand. They are not poetic flourishes. They are the residue of a population that has been reading this exact landscape for longer than almost any other people on Earth have been reading theirs. That is not nothing. The most prominent name in this whole rewriting is an archaeologist called Michael Petraglia, who led the Paleo Deserts project that, over years of patient work in the Saudi sand, pulled together the fossils, the tools, the lake beds, and the climate data into one coherent picture. His team is the one that found the finger. His team is the one that mapped the 5 green windows. His team is the one whose work, more than anyone else's, put Arabia on the map of human origins. What he has argued is something simple. Arabia is not a periphery. It is not a transit lounge between continents. It is one of the central rooms in the entire story of who we are. And the Saudi desert, when you stand on it, is full of the receipts. Now, I have to be honest with you, because the story is not as clean as I just made it sound. We do not yet have ancient DNA directly from those 85,000-year-old people. The climate is too brutal. Bones in that kind of heat do not preserve genetic material well. Almost everything we know about the deep continuity of Arabian populations comes from reading modern DNA backwards, comparing it to neighboring ancient genomes from places like Bahrain and the Levant, and modeling what must have come before. That is a real limit. It means the precise time depth is still being worked out. It means there are competing models for which exact route those first people took, how many times they passed through, and how much intermixing happened with later arrivals from East Africa, Persia, and Anatolia. There are pieces missing. But the work has not stopped. The Paleo Deserts team has, by their own count, only excavated a few hundred of the thousands of ancient lake basins they have identified from satellite images. Most of the desert has not been touched. New stone tools, new bones, new dating layers come out of the sand every season. There are caves deep in the limestone of the peninsula that may yet give up genuinely ancient DNA, the cold and the dark, protecting it from the heat above. The Saudi authorities have, in recent years, opened the country to international archaeology in a way that simply was not possible a generation ago. We are not at the end of this story. We are barely at the beginning of being able to read it. What is not missing, though, is the broad shape of it. That a piece of a human hand dropped on a green shoreline 90,000 years ago says we were here. That a series of stacked lake beds in the Nafud says we kept coming back. That a child's footprint beside an elephant's says we were not just passing. And that the modern genetic data from thousands of living Saudis says some of those people never left. I find that quietly moving. I want to come back to the hippo. She is wading in a lake that no longer exists. The lake is in the middle of what will, 85,000 years from now, be called the Nafud Desert, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in a world she cannot imagine. The water is cool. The grass is green. There are children somewhere on the far shore, small and curious, learning to throw stones, learning to read the shape of the wind. One of those children grows up. One of them has children of their own. Down the long, long chain of generations, Through the closing of the rains and the rising of the dunes and the slow vanishing of every lake she has ever known, the descendants of those people stay. They watch the green leave. They learn the dry. They keep going. 85,000 years later, one of them is sitting in a car in Riyadh, in traffic, scrolling a phone, with no idea that the dust outside the window is the bed of an ancient lake, and that the bones of a hippopotamus are lying somewhere underneath the asphalt. That is the part of the story I keep coming back to. It changes what the desert looks like to me. The next time you see a photograph of the Arabian dunes, the high golden waves, the long shadows of late afternoon, the absolute silence of it, I want you to remember that under that sand is a lake. Under that lake is a shoreline. And on that shoreline, 90,000 years ago, were people. People whose many times great-grandchildren never left. The Arabian Peninsula was never the empty middle of the map. It was the first new home. And the people who live there now are not a recent layer painted onto an old place. They are the place. The line that began on a green shoreline beside a hippo 85,000 years ago is still running, still there, still breathing, still keeping the oldest secret of the door that everyone else walked through.